Hey, my name is Hall Daly, and I do government relations at Caltech. And I want to thank the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory for being our conference host. And I know that all of you have had a very good piece of understanding about what's going into the current state of affairs in California with early earthquake warning. We wanted to give you a little bit of a national flavor. And so, as is appropriate with early earthquake warning, I thought I would begin with a countdown. So we're going to start at 30. And we're not going to go by seconds. We're going to go by years. So 30 years ago, Tom Heaton wrote a paper, and I'm not sure whether, I keep asking, was this in a science fiction magazine? Was this in a science magazine? But we do know it was about the concept of early earthquake warning. If you move down to about 20 years ago, all of a sudden you probably had the first new tool that became available. And the way it became available was very interesting because it was at the national level where a group of 7 California congressmen, led by David Dreyer, a Republican, and Esteban Torres, a Democrat, crossed the aisle together and approached the administration and said, you know, this FEMA rule about hazard mitigation is way too narrow. It really ought to be open to doing fundamental research on trying to create situations that not only save lives, but also create the opportunity for better business resilience and continuity. Those terms were not used back 20 years ago. I know because I lobbied for it. I never heard of those terms. But the fact of the matter is it was a significant reason why $12 million was freed up through FEMA to Cal OES, and Caltech raised another $3.5 million. And out of that, along with a lot of people probably who are in this room, contributed toward ShakeMap. And the development of ShakeMap and the subsequent adaptation for ShakeCast was a significant new public safety tool and public service tool in terms of helping emergency personnel, especially in terms of knowing where the greatest shaking was. 15 years ago was an authorization for ANSS, which you heard a little bit about, the Advanced National Seismic System. Now, I have a little column of numbers about how much has been spent on ANSS since about 2001. But let me tell you what the authorization was for. Just so you don't feel too cocky walking out of the room about, oh, this is going to be easy to fund. ANSS was authorized at $180 million to be spent within 4 years to upgrade the entire seismic network of the United States. Now, excluding the 1 year of ARRA money, which, by the way, is at the 5-year countdown mark, the highest amount that was ever appropriated for ANSS is about $8.5 million. So we still haven't gotten to the $180 million mark, and we're in year 12. Now, the prospects are better now, in no small part because 5 years ago, ARRA money at the worst time of the economy was able to be taken advantage of in the state of California in order to make the system more modern and more robust. So it paved the way for something that happened 3 years ago, which is where we go to our panel. And that is the Moore Foundation took a novel interest in an unusual topic, which this conference is the third of, and decided what it wanted to do was to see whether or not the public and private consortium that was already doing lots of work on earthquake monitoring, detection, and, in fact, a little on warning, could be worked with. And this is why I want to have Nancy Koch, who's here with us from the Moore Foundation, to talk a little bit about that experience. And I'm going to tell you that there's lots of great things to tell you about Nancy, but probably the most important one is that she's ready for this. She is extremely well prepared for this to deal with seismologists and geologists and scientists and academicians. And the reason is because she plays drums in a rock band, okay?
Actually, the reason that I'm qualified to be here is because in 1989 I was hiding under my desk in pantyhose and a skirt suit, shaking in a non-reinforced steel building 30 floors above San Francisco and watching a massive photocopy machine go back and forth. And so when I found the opportunity to get involved in early earthquake warning, I jumped on it, earthquake early warning. I was asked to give, and I'll be happy to give you a little bit of background about the Moore Foundation's role and what we see coming ahead for us It starts, of course, with Gordon Moore, who co-founded a small company down in the Silicon Valley called Intel. Gordon is an extraordinary human being, and as if founding Intel weren't enough, for his second act, what he did in the, just about the year 2000 was he took $5 billion of his and his wife's assets, all in the form of Intel stock, and created a $5 billion private foundation, and gave it a very broad mandate. Basically said, go forth and create positive change for future generations, which is just a wonderful and lovely thing to do. And the foundation ever since has been spending off of the interest generated from that corpus at a rate of about 5% a year, trying to find things that we could do that would make a difference, a durable difference in important areas for future generations. The 5% a year has varied, but basically that means about $250 to $300 million a year worth of charitable activities. And the areas that we focus in are environmental conservation, patient care, and the area that's most relevant for purposes of our discussion today, funding basic science. And in the world of basic science, what we look for is pivotal opportunities, not areas where everyone else is funding, but areas where a relatively small contribution that we can manage can make a phase shift, a real pivot, a real difference in the trajectory of the science, where something good can truly come about that might not come about but for our involvement. And that is how we perceive the opportunity to participate in the earthquake early warning system world, and why it is, I think, that we were asked to participate here today. I went back to take a look at the grants that we made in 2011 to Caltech, University of Washington, and University of California. They were each about $2 million, and they each were about to go for 3.5 years, total of about $6 million, and I'll come on to Doug here in a second. But I also went and read through what it was they were supposed to do, and that's when I kind of got nervous about being on this panel. I saw, waveform signals, computational rupture dynamics, displacement data, algorithms, and I was saying to myself, I'm a lawyer, what am I supposed to do about these words in front of this kind of crowd? But fortunately, there was the purpose paragraph, which some lawyer wrote. And the purpose was, and you'll understand this, advanced scientific knowledge that will enable creation of EEWS. And that's what has happened. The combined assets, the combined investment from a private foundation like the Moore Foundation with the government funding from the USGS and the extremely gifted science contributions from Caltech, UW, and UC have got us to the place where we are today collectively, where we're able to say things like what Senator Padilla said in his article today, which is the science is sound and the technology is proven. And I'm sure there are a lot of scientists who might quibble at the edges of that, but as a citizen who was once under the desk shaking, I can tell you that that is very reassuring, and that for the Moore Foundation, that proves that it was a perfect opportunity to give a boost in an area where really durable and meaningful change could come about if this can be brought to practical application. We think that part of the key to practical application is continuing to work closely with the USGS, and that's why I'm so delighted to be here with Doug Gibbon. We ended up making a joint grant to the USGS in 2012, specifically so that the USGS, who is central under the law and central in terms of the practical application, bringing the technology to practical application, would have some resources available in the form of Doug to coordinate with the 3 grantees, to coordinate with the state of California, to try and move this forward in a way that made sense. And from where we sit, we're just absolutely delighted with the contribution that Doug and the USGS have brought to the table so far today. Looking ahead, what we would hope to see is a lot of what was manifested here today, a real political will to move forward on the federal front for sure. I was delighted to see the state political will manifested as well. We would dearly love to support the private end of that using whatever connections we have that would be useful, and we're very glad to be presenting here today.
Thank you very much. So the countdown continues. We were at 3, we're now at 2. And we're going to bring in somebody whose actual experience with early earthquake warning starts around 2 years ago. But I cannot underestimate how important she is to this process. I'm going to first highlight one of her peers on the U.S. Senate side, and what they did this year under the leadership of Senator Dianne Feinstein, and that was that they inserted language in a reauthorization of the Department of Homeland Security that essentially permits states, and in our case, California OES, to actually apply for funds to support activities like early warning for disasters, including earthquakes, to be supported by a broader array of funds than could have been the case in the past. Now, this was already demonstrated, as you already heard, through the City of Los Angeles, which used some of those funds to help upgrade and modernize and add 125 stations over the last year and a half. So Courtney Fogwell is a legislative assistant for Representative Adam Schiff, whom I'm proud to say represents, among other places, Caltech and JPL. In addition to her work on earthquake policy, she handles agriculture, energy, environment, Social Security, civil rights issues. This is typical of just the few things that congressional staffers have to do. She graduated magna cum laude from Penn, and basically she is from Connecticut, where you read about earthquakes instead of actually experiencing them. We're very happy to have her here, and we're hoping to give her the at least virtual experience of an earthquake. So Courtney, please.
So yeah, if it starts shaking, you need to tell me what to do, because I'm a newbie. So yeah, as you said, I'm a legislative assistant for Adam Schiff. And he's been a really strong supporter and leader in Congress when it comes to the earthquake early warning system. And you know, you always hear bad things about Congress recently, but despite the dysfunction in Washington, we've actually had a pretty major breakthrough recently. Because, you know, as you all aware, there are massive budget cuts, and that's really hindered our ability to invest in critical infrastructure that's essential for both public safety and the economy. But for the first time ever, it looks like, no guarantees yet, you never know what Congress is going to do, it looks like the West Coast Earthquake Early Warning System will receive $5 million in federal funding for fiscal year 2015. So we're very excited about that. For those of you who are not familiar with how the appropriations process works, I'll just give you the quick and dirty explanation. Congress is responsible for funding the government, and while the process has definitely gotten messy over the past couple of years, it does so through 12 funding appropriations bills. The Earthquake Early Warning System, because it's part of USGS, is within the Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill. So what happens is each bill has to pass its respective subcommittee, then it goes to the full Appropriations Committee, and then it's passed on the House floor. Same for the Senate bill, and then the Senate and House bills, there are always going to be differences between the two. So their differences are worked out in conference, and then that conference bill is then passed by both chambers, and then if all goes well, it's signed by the president into law. So this $5 million that I mentioned for fiscal year 15 is largely a result of Mr. Schiff's efforts, and he's been working with other members as well, especially Dianne Feinstein in the Senate. And it started back in 2012 when he and Representative Ken Calvert, who's a Republican from California, and he's currently the chairman of the Interior and Environment Subcommittee for the Appropriations Committee. They wrote to the Office of Management and Budget within the Executive Office of the President. And this letter was signed by 27 other members of Congress from the West Coast. And this is huge, you know, support for the system. And essentially in their letter, they requested that OMB really support the system in FY14. You know, they explain what we all here know, how it's an invaluable tool for public safety and for the economy. And then also because Mr. Schiff is on the Appropriations Committee, he was able to see that language was included in the FY14 committee report for the Interior bill that, again, expressed the importance of the system. So unfortunately, no funds were allocated in fiscal year 14, but that definitely laid the groundwork for what was to come. So that brings us to where we are now. Congress is currently working on appropriating funds for fiscal year 15. So that process started back in April when members of Congress would submit their request letters to appropriation subcommittees. Everything in Congress is letters. And because the early warning system is one of Mr. Schiff's priorities, he once again made a push for federal funding, except this year he made a much stronger push. And so he led a group of 25 other members of Congress from the West Coast, including representatives from Washington and Oregon. We had Representative Peter DeFazio, who was the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, on that letter, showing strong support. And that letter requested $16.1 million for fiscal year 15 for the early warning system. So the interior bill for the House was released a couple months ago, and as I said, that includes $5 million for the early warning system. And just the other week, the Senate bill was released, and that includes $5 million too. So we fully recognize that $5 million is not going to build out the system. It's not going to be the end all. But those of us in Washington consider this a really huge win. Lieutenant Governor earlier was talking about political will, and this to us is a sign of that. In today's political climate, when Democrats and Republicans can barely agree on anything, the fact that we have bipartisan, bicameral support for this new system is huge. And the best part is that this $5 million that I mentioned is new funding. So the entire earthquakes hazards account within the appropriations bill was plussed up. It didn't just take some earthquake money from one area and put it into the earthquake hazards. So we're very hopeful that this is, this is just the beginning. And we really think that this just means that more people are recognizing the value of the system. So we definitely look forward to working with California as well as Oregon and Washington and the administration to really make sure that we have funding going forward. So this is this is a public good that we think everybody should have access to.
I'm going to do my little one last one. Okay, so we're down to countdown number 1, which means this is the last guy between you and probably the bar. So Doug Given coordinates for the USGS, obviously, the early earthquake warning activities, working out of Southern California. And to be honest with you, shepherding early earthquake warning through the coalition is probably requires the diplomacy of a Swiss diplomat and the juggling talents of P.T. Barnum's best. But I have to say one thing. I've been at Caltech for a quarter century, and I know people who've worked at Berkeley. And there is no better agency to partner with than the U.S. Geological Survey. They fight for their own budget. They have to fight inside their own agency and department. And then they have to fight to get it into the Office of Management and Budget to the attention of the President. And I don't know if you've been checking lately, but the Secretary of Interior is not very high on the succession list to become president in the event of a disaster. So they don't necessarily have the biggest seat in the room. But the fact is they work extremely hard on this. And early earthquake warning has come quite a long ways. That $5 million is extremely significant because it took a long time just to get it up into the $850,000 a year. But the biggest thing is people like Michelle Moskowitz, Betsy Boyd of Oregon, Sarah Castro of Washington, and others basically said to people like Courtney, we don't want you to do anything other than what the president wants unless it's new money. Because if you carve out of the existing network money for early earthquake warning, all you do is cut out the foundation in order to put on something that won't be reliable or robust enough. So with that, the person who knows more about early earthquake warning in terms of where it's come from and where it's headed, probably more importantly, is Doug Given. So.
Thank you, Hall. Is Tom still in the room? There you are. When I was looking for a subject for my dissertation in like 1980, Tom pitched earthquake early warning. I did not choose that. I instead did seismicity of the San Jacinto Fault or something arcane like that nobody cared about. But despite that, it's really been in the background for decades. And the USGS has been making steady progress along with our university, state partners, privates, all the folks who are dedicated to this, despite the limited funding that you've heard about, have been making slow and steady progress towards this. We want to make it an inexorable march, that it is something that inevitably comes to protect lives and property in the U.S. The United States Geological Survey and the earthquake program, the NEHRP, is dedicated to reducing losses in the United States. And we're on a mission. We are very dedicated folks, and we work with a lot of other dedicated folks who really understand that. And you hear from folks often, they personalize that experience. Oh, I remember the 1989 earthquake or the 1994 earthquake. It becomes a personal mission to accomplish this goal of reducing injuries, deaths, and losses. So since 1999, that has been explicit in the ANSS founding document. And the USGS has put what little money it had where its mouth was. And in 2002, began funding external research in earthquake early warning. We formalized that process in 2006 and began a phased approach of R&D for earthquake early warning, 3 years at a time. That first phase was an R&D effort. The second phase was kicked off by the Show Me speech from Bill Leith, who said, you guys say you can do early warning? Well, show me. So the next 3-year process was that, and it terminated in the development of the demonstration system, which is operating today and has been producing earthquake early warnings to our beta users for more than 2.5 years now. So in the third phase that we're in the midst of right now, the object is to move from demonstration system to production prototype. To take this code that has been put together by scientists using Lord knows what languages and MATLAB and all sorts of things like that, and turn it into a highly reliable system that can be managed and completely tested so that we know it will work when it needs to work. That's been the march, and that's brought us to this point. And we believe that the demonstration, along with some chance from things like the South Napa earthquake, has put us right there on the edge where we have the opportunity to complete this system and begin limited rollouts in the way that you've heard other countries have done to demonstrate the system, to get the public and the users ready so that this system will have the maximum effectiveness in the US. You heard some of the questions about the cost of the system. There is an implementation plan published by USGS that does include budget numbers based on our best information at the time we did that plan. It's not that old, but things are moving quickly. You heard Richard give you the sort of per capita cost for the 3-state West Coast system. Another way that you can look at it, though, is through a fairly simple-minded cost-benefit analysis. If you look at the FEMA numbers for the annualized cost of earthquake damage in the 3 West Coast states, and most of that, I understand, is just building damage, and there's not much mitigation in building damage from an early warning system, but it did not account for lots of collateral effects like loss of business opportunities and lost production and things like that. But if you just take those raw numbers and ask the question, what percentage of those losses do we have to mitigate in order to make the system cost effective based on our current budget? The answer is 0.4%. And if you do it in terms of lives, and you look at the annualized losses in terms of lives lost from that same FEMA report, and you ask the question, how many lives do we have to save to make it cost effective? And there are annualized numbers for that. This is kind of macabre, but the cost of a human life is somewhere around $6 million. And so the answer is you have to mitigate about 3% of the fatalities for early warning to be completely cost effective. So we do have some answers. They're sketchy, back of the envelope sorts of calculations, I'll admit, but early warning makes a lot of sense, and it's going to happen. It's just a question of whether it happens before the earthquake or after.
So we like to invite questions from the audience about from a national perspective. I do want to start with a question, though, while the majority of people here are Californians or from abroad, talk a little bit about what the cost would go toward for a 5-year implementation program.
You sure you don't want to?
Here's pointing to you.
Well, again, this is all spelled out in the implementation plan, and the folks who have been involved in the Earthquake Early Warning Project through all those phases that I described sat down, and we had several phone calls. We laid out a spreadsheet, and we worked out some numbers. But in simplistic terms, there are 5 pieces to the early warning system. The first is the sensors in the ground. You need adequate density, and those sensors need to be of the right type, high enough quality, and have low latency. You also need to get the data back to a center for processing, collation, in order to understand what the Earth is doing. So you need telemetry, and very hardened telemetry. That's an expensive part. You cannot depend on the internet. You must depend on other more hardened ways of moving data, and in fact, you must have multiple ways of moving data. The third part is the central part of the processing. Now, you can do an on-site approach. That's a valid approach. But for a networked approach, those data have to come back to a central site and be put together into a picture of what the Earth is doing. And so you need central processing. We've got algorithms, but there's the science and the code that I've already mentioned. But of course, you need infrastructure. You need computers. You need standby power. You need networking. All that infrastructure needs to be built. Once you generate an alert, that alert must be distributed out to the users. Again, the internet is not going to be the most reliable way to do that. And so we'll need to develop more robust ways to make sure that those data, those alerts, get out to the users. And then finally, the 5th piece is the use itself. And you can think of that in 2 categories, people and things. We've talked about people education, and that's going to have to happen and be ongoing, and we have to get the messaging clear and, in fact, decide what the message is. Is duck cover and hold on really the best action in all circumstances? Probably not. How do you send a more complex message? Well, one possible solution is a smartphone app that knows where you are and what your situation and circumstances are and can tell you explicitly what to do. It's different if you're driving versus on the 40th floor of a building. So that's one possibility for that. But there's a huge education and development component for people. And in addition to that, of course, there's the automated responses. And all these things that I'm describing on the end user end are probably going to be all happening in the private industry sector. They will be developed by companies for companies to close a valve or stop a train or lower a container from a crane. So those are the 5 major components of the system, and they all need development simultaneously.
So, Courtney, we haven't found a significant opposition to the concept of an earthquake warning system. The problem has always been finding champions who actually go to bat for it. Is that a fair assessment of what we have going forward? That we now have some champions? Do we need to round up more supporters for them, or do we just have to keep avoiding opposition?
I think both. I mean, you always have some people that feel that this is not a federal issue. So in that case, those people are going to be opposed to any federal money going to the system. Or you have some who feel that this should be a pay-for service. You pay, $10 a year or what have you, and you get the warnings to your cell phone or to your computer or whatever. But I think the majority of people, at least, agree that this should be a public good and see that this is a federal issue that affects the entire nation. As said before, just because you're not the one experiencing this shaking doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to suffer the consequences of a major earthquake. There are so many businesses here in California, and if they get shaken up a little bit too much, that'll have effects around the nation. And obviously, people don't really want to have feel the economic effects of that. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to support, I'm going to sound like a congressional staffer right now. Write your members. We really need to drum up the support so that maybe next year, instead of seeing 5 million, we can see a little more than that, because they want to hear from their constituents, yeah. So the support is definitely necessary. To do, I think, any more, honestly. Yeah.
So, and a question for Nancy. I was thinking, not from your drumming background, but from your early earthquake warning project.
Use the mic.
For Nancy, I'm wondering if how one of the lessons learned relates to whether or not you would advise the Moore Foundation and similar foundations to try and be a partner with a government entity as part of the partnership.
I would say that it would depend on the specific matter at hand, but in something like this, where the role of the government, it's a classic role of the government, public health and safety, and that's institutionalized in laws, and they're going to be the carrier of the message, the primary message, and in that case, what you build must coordinate well with what they have and what they're doing. And the idea of doing that in a completely disconnected way would make no sense to us.
Well, we'd be happy to entertain any questions if there are any, but we're not necessarily trying to keep you from something. How's that for either way you want to go?
So just now you mentioned the communication case. So you just said that the internet will not be good for communicating from the stations, sensors to the center, or from the center to the end users. Why is that? Okay, I may continue. Just hold on. Okay.
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that we don't know what kind of damage would be sustained by the internet and how it will behave after a very strong earthquake. And some people make the argument, well, if the early warning system is really an early warning system, the message will be out before the strong shaking and the damage occurs, which might be true, but might not. So, for example, through the shakeout study, it appeared to be the case that an earthquake starting on the southern San Andreas, for example, might ripple through and destroy the power system and cut off power to the Los Angeles area before the shaking arrived. Sort of a poor man's early warning system, but it would also shut down everybody's computers and the internet itself before that message can get out. In addition, the system needs to work for the aftershocks. And so if the system is, even if the early warning goes out, but then the internet is destroyed, we are blind to the aftershocks. So there are other technologies out there that are possible, including satellite and broadcast radio, which probably show a lot of promise.
Okay, Justin, yes, right. For the major, for the first big earthquake, yes, I think the network will work for that. I think we have the experience for big earthquake of magnitude 7 or 6. Or 6, another one, 6.5, they did work. The internet did work. And I think this may be also true for Japanese version for some of the earthquakes as well. Even the March 11th 9.0 earthquake, I think it did work. For the aftershocks, I agree with you, yes. Maybe some other communication technology should be used, even including the satellite. But it will be very difficult for the end users to use the satellites. Maybe, as you said, the radios may be good for the general public. Okay, that's all.
I have a question for probably all of you, which is when we look at the role of the federal government in this system, the USGS has an obvious role in terms of warning for natural hazards. But then we recognize there are lots of other kinds of things that go around any kind of response system like this. And do you see any federal roles outside the USGS, for instance, FEMA or things especially in Department of Homeland Security or Department of Energy, and is there some way to begin engaging those other agencies?
I'm by no means a FEMA expert, but as he said, as Hall said, the FEMA is involved already, and you know, Senator Feinstein also made sure that in the Senate Homeland Security bill, it includes report language directing FEMA to prioritize grant funding for these early warning systems. Department of Energy, I'm not sure. Definitely look into that for you. But it definitely is something that's beyond USGS.
Yeah, Tom, as you well know, there are 4 agencies which are knitted together under something that Congressman George Brown from California set up in the early 80s, which was called NEHRP, National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Project or Program. One of those agencies I don't think has ever had anything to do with earthquakes, and still doesn't. And yet, it is on the America Competes Act as one of the most important research fueling agencies in the federal government, and that's NIST. So obviously there, I know, but that's okay. So there is an opportunity there, maybe not immediately, but at some point. From the other 3 agencies, I think we're doing pretty well, and I think Senator Feinstein's change in the language qualifier for what one can use certain types of funds for, opening the door more for earthquake warning, is a very important step, just as it was true 20 years ago when they changed the FEMA rule on hazard mitigation, which at least opened the door. That now we're reopening that door again. I do have a question. It was hard enough getting the $5 million through the House. It was delightful to see it mirrored in the Senate. It's not like that means next year it's going to be easier, especially given there's certain circumstances you might want to point out which might encourage people to write or go talk to their members, because it's going to actually be harder next year to deal with budget numbers.
Yes, so write to your members. With the elections coming up, possibly the Senate changing hands, it'll definitely be even more difficult to increase accounts, especially when it comes to new money. So it'll be a little bit of a roller coaster, but we're going to keep on pushing, and we're going to try to work together more with the administration, continue communicating with the Office of Management and Budget, so that not only do we have certain congressional requests and certain requests coming from all of you and USGS, but also that the Budget Office really realizes how important it is.
So one of the constant juggles, one of the constant juggles has been, it's really helpful for us to have some good news from California to take back to Washington. And then it's very helpful for us to have some good news from Washington to bring back to California. And the fact that this game has been going on for a quarter century is a testament to the fact that you're only as good as your last earthquake, as everybody in this room knows, for funding purposes. And the more distance between your last earthquake and today, it means that much harder to get funding. So I hate to say it, but a year after the South Napa, it's going to be harder to get funding than here we are 10 days after it. So again, I just want to encourage activism to be supportive of this.
Hi. Mr. Given, you talked about 5 pieces to any system like this, and it seems like the first 4 up through alert distribution is where most of the focus is in this conversation, where the message actually goes out. And then when you get to the 5th step, where people have something to do, that's where emergency managers, we come in with education of the public, putting the message out there, figuring out how we want to use that information. My question, though, is about the second part of the 5th step, which is the things. That's where I think a lot of people who aren't in this room come into play. Private industry, technology companies who can take that information and then do something with it. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe those people are here. Maybe they are in the conversation. But I'm hoping you can talk about some of the work that's being done to incentivize or engage those private industry in this conversation. Because from floating this idea past people I'm connected with in those worlds, they say, well, what's in it for us from a profit perspective? And short of changing building codes, changing fire codes, or offering, the idea of an incentive competition possibly, how do we convince Google that there's profit in them for them? Of course, they see the risk of needing the system, but how does that translate into providing products that benefit and enhance our response capability and people's protection?
Well, we think that the incentive is going to be profit, just like it is in all businesses, that once the early warning alerts are available, that distribution and adding value to it and creating those devices that will actually take action, that will all be a new area of business. And there are, I know there are at least some representatives of that industry in the room now and that will be attending this conference. So it's certainly not the role of USGS to implement actions in factories. So that clearly will be the job of the private sector. But we can play the role of encouraging that kind of activity, and we're in fact doing that. One of the mechanisms we have to do that is to enter into technology transfer agreements with companies so that we can team with companies and say, okay, here's what we've got, show us what you've got, and then we'll put those together and make a viable product that you can then go out and sell to clients. And so a number of companies are engaged in this process for those reasons. In the state process, for example, the committee on models includes several private companies who are connected with early warning in various ways, mass notification, equipment manufacturers, and so forth. I think that's where the public-private partnership is going to come into play most, is in the actual implementation of the early warning activities out there in the private sector. I mean, I have no idea what's out there and what the right thing to do is in a glass factory or, you know, somebody who makes sriracha or something like that. So hopefully they won't spill. But so that's, you know, we recognize that as a limitation, and that's why I think I said that those last two, the distribution and use, is squarely in the private sector domain to make that happen. Now, as I understand it, our Japanese colleagues did exactly that, and they have a business development organization within the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and they also created a nonprofit organization to foster those kinds of relationships. And I'd actually like to learn more about that from the Japanese.
Doug, I wonder if you have a view on this, whether from the perspective of putting together a compelling case for federal funding, a private sector argument that this is loss and risk reduction for us versus there are commercial opportunities here with significant upside for us. Those are two different kinds of thrusts, and I wonder if you think one or the other is more effective in terms of generating support at the federal level, or if you see them as complementary.
Well, I think we have to use all the arguments we can marshal, so we'll use them both. But I think the folks in the state have actually asked this question a little bit of the CEA, the California Earthquake Authority, the folks who actually sell earthquake insurance in California. So you could imagine there being a monetary incentive to have your premiums lowered if you have early warning implemented in your factory or your building or something like that. So I think we have to look for all of these potential opportunities. And, you know, I'm a scientist, and I'm the wrong guy to ask. You got to talk to economists and business people about how all this stuff would best work.
And I think the three university partners with the Moore Grant would all echo the same thing, and that is that technology transfer from the university community is a highly valued commodity, particularly on Capitol Hill and within the agencies of government, because it's believed to be a job creator. And any time you can do that, that's an indispensable asset. Please.
Yeah, Ken Hudnett, USGS, and I'd like to mention two other federal agencies just to think outside the usual box a bit. One is National Park Service, and Yosemite in particular. We all probably, or many of us, have read John Muir's words of his experience during the 1872 earthquake at Yosemite Valley with the rock falls. Talk about a near miss. If we were to have a future earthquake at the time when there are thousands of park visitors on those trails, when a big rock fall were to occur. So I think National Park Service has a responsibility for life safety that would benefit from early warning. And another is the FAA. So a story that maybe some of you are familiar with from the South Napa earthquake. Because it happened at 3:20 a.m., this did not come into play. But in a future earthquake, you can imagine. The South Napa earthquake, the fault rupture that broke is the West Napa Fault, and one strand of that goes right through Napa County Airport. The earthquake shattered all the glass out of the control tower at that airport. Imagine a commercial airliner coming in for landing when a big earthquake hits at SFO or LAX. I think FAA has a stake in this.
I agree. Tom.
One area that is quite a bit of concern that we have trouble studying scientifically at the moment is the question of fires following earthquakes. And that's a source of quite a bit of damage. And in some cases, if you get enough fires started, you get a major conflagration, in which case it's enormous damage. And I think one of the directions, at least I'll be taking my research in, is trying to figure out, can we decrease the number of ignitions of fires using this technology? I don't know the answer to that, but if we can, it may make an enormous difference in the long run.
Yeah, I know in Southern California we've had mixed responses from utilities for water, electricity, and power generation. Some have infrastructure that is adequate to taking advantage of an early warning, some don't. So, and then some actually don't even know if they can take advantage of it. That was the most peculiar response we got. And I think others here in Berkeley have been working with the utilities up north here on those same questions. But the vulnerability of the transmission is a serious issue as well. I want to thank our panelists for being extraordinary people and also joining us here on stage today. And thank all of you.